Molecular Theology, Lecture 3 How Life Lives in DNA. In this lecture, Professor Dr. A Ninan explains how life lives in DNA. This, in other words, is how the principle of life called consciousness is organized in genomic DNA, or how the genome is conscientized. He explains this with the use of an elaborate model of the tree of life. According to him, the tree is the real software of life, of which DNA is the hardware. The physical DNA houses the non-physical trees of life at the levels of the self, the triple spirit, the soul, and the psyche. Each of it has its own individual trees of life. Each of the 7 trees has a series of parameters as presented in the expanded table given. This table is a reliable guide for the biblical hermeneutics at the levels of life, at the individual, that is, self-consciousness, as well as God consciousness at the highest level, and this is explained in detail in the lecture which is to follow.
Molecular Biology, Lecture 3 How Life Lives in DNA. This, in other words, is how consciousness is organized in DNA and how consciousness is organized in living systems at large. So this lecture is based on these two important topics. Before I pass on to discussions on this, I would like to present to you a quotation from the world-famous author Paul Davies, who wrote in his book entitled The Fifth Miracle. He writes, "Life's distinctiveness lies not in its chemistry as such, but in its informational properties. A living organism is a complex information processing system. What is needed is to decode this system, which lies in the realm of the science of consciousness. There is a non-material something inside living organisms, something unique and literally vital to their operation. It is not an essence, nor a force, nor an atom with a zing, Z-I-N-G, zing. That extra something is a certain type of information, or, to use the modern jargon, software." So, according to him, this is a very, very valid finding, a valid idea. According to him, life is an information system. And in fact, this is the software. Life is the software in DNA. That means DNA is the hardware of which life is the software. This exactly is what I mean by the term tree of life in DNA. So far we have seen how a model of the tree of life in DNA can be perceived. And we have seen that this model is based on 7 symbols derived from DNA innates themselves. From the frames and fabrics of the chemical called DNA, the chemical molecule called DNA, we have derived a metaphysical tree of life. So The metaphysical is derived in and through the physical. That is the importance. Now, we have before us 7 symbols constituting the tree of life model of DNA. These are, I repeat, capital I for the self. We have archetypally related each symbol to corresponding realms of consciousness. So, capital I for self, called the tree of life at the self level. Then small I for the ideating self, plus or the cross sign for the signing self, capital A for the alphabetic aspect of the self or the articulating aspect of the self, capital H for the soul field of the self, capital S for the psyche field of the self, and capital O for the genomic field of the self. In all these 7 trees of life, the self is central. So, when the self feels in the name field, it is called the I tree. Then the self feels in the ideating field, it is called the small I tree. When the self feels in the plus field, it is called the plus tree. When the self feels in the A field, it is called the A tree. These 3 trees together constitute what is called the triple spirit. Capital I corresponds to the self, and these 3 fields constitute the triple spirit. Then you have the H tree, which is the basis of the soul. The S tree is the basis of the psyche, and the O tree is the basis of the O tree. Now, how these 7 trees are organized in the DNA molecule is a mystery. So, one tree within the other tree. So, I have presented it as a outer circle, the genome, then you have the S, then you have the H, then you have the A, then you have the plus, and finally you have the small I and capital I. It is presented as a figure on page 69 of my book, Cosmic Code of Life, and presented here for easy reference. Now, you must closely examine this figure, wherein I have charted out all the 7 fields and given the all the 7 symbols from DNA and given the corresponding fields in brackets, that is I for self, small I for idea, plus for sign, A for word, H for soul, S for psyche, and O for the genome. This I am repeating so that you must fix it in your mind, this figure and the corresponding fields of life. Okay. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that subtle entities like the psyche, soul, spirit, and self are related to life science in a tree of life hierarchy with the aid of DNA archetypes. See, so this is a hierarchy, a tree of life hierarchy with the aid of DNA archetypes. The advantage with the tree of life model is that it enables a holistic vision of physical life consistent with what metaphysics and religions teach on consciousness as the stuff of life. Scientists talk about the stuff of life without knowing what this stuff is or how this stuff is organized in DNA. Consciousness as the stuff of life and the self as its emergent reality. The self is the reality that emerges from the genome. Actually, the self, the conscious self, stands out in bold relief as the gestalt of the genome with its 7 types of expressions. This is a base model of self-organization in DNA which offers scope for further expansion as a universal model of fielding of consciousness in living systems at large. So from this base model of the self fielding through 7 fields, you can further elaborate it or elevate it into a universal model of fielding of consciousness common for all living beings, common for all living systems in the biosphere and in all the other spheres of life, including the biosphere. In fact, there are 7 spheres of life that go well with the series of 7 which I have already exposed before you. These are the biosphere with the O tree, the psychosphere with the S tree, the noosphere with the H tree, then the logosphere with the I plus A 3 trees, and finally the consosphere with the I tree. These are names which I have given to these spheres of life, where these individual trees form the basis of life there. We shall come to the details of cosmic life later. Here we will come back and see how this base model of DNA can be expanded into a universal model of organization of consciousness in living systems at large. This actually enables holistic discussions on the nature and meaning of life, incorporating data from a wide variety of disciplines on consciousness as life principle. In addition to its use in developing an extra-dimensional vision of life, it also enables exposition of scriptural teachings on consciousness in relation to the nature, origin, and meaning of DNA-based life and of life at large in cosmic connection. It also helps to decode the symbolic accounts of the Bible and to present a modern science-based hermeneutics of creation accounts of the Bible as given, as I have already explained, without the aid of the tree of life. Now it is possible to explain it more and more realistic and in more elaborate terms using the tree of life, which I will do later. Now, the expanded model of the tree of life is given on page 72 of my book, Cosmic Code of Life, and reproduced here for easy reference. This expanded model of the tree of life provides a rich database under the following parameters linked to consciousness as life principles. So it is a very elaborate table with the following parameters linked to consciousness as the principle of life. The first one is patterns of DNA, that is the 7 symbols of DNA, then related fields of life, which I have already mentioned, then the tree of life codes that you must listen carefully. The tree of life codes are the I tree of the self, that is a pure tree, non-dual tree with only one tree. Then the spirit, I have told you that it is a triple spirit. The triple spirit along with the I tree you have 4 trees for the spirit, 5 trees for the soul, that is capitalized small I plus a H. So it is called the S tree of the soul. 6 trees for the psyche, that is capitalized small I plus a HS, that is 6 trees with the S tree as the outermost tree. And finally, you have for the body the genomic tree with 7 trees, that is capitalized small I plus a HSO. You see how these 7 trees are organized in living systems. Now, along with this, I have also related these trees to their plant motifs, element motifs, rock motif, precious stone motif, metal motif, serpent motif, etc., etc. This table can be elaborated depending on the knowledge you have. You can gain on various aspects of consciousness as the principle of life. This is the model of the elaborate tree of life I have perceived from DNA. Now, the above database in the table help us to elevate the chemical molecule called DNA as the key molecule of life and the vehicle of the conscious self itself. Integrated use of the above data helps us to explain how the subjectivity of life phenomena is organized in archetypal relation to the objectivity of the genome. It is thus possible to link the spiritual teachings of religions on consciousness with the physical findings on life science, aided by the tree of life, which stands in between science and religion, with one arm in science and the other in religion. It enables us to gain knowledge from a wide variety of disciplines and use it to develop an integrated science of consciousness as life principle. An integrated science of consciousness as life principle, which includes all knowledge you can gather on consciousness, and also a super unified vision of reality itself, as to up to and including the concept of God as life, you see. So it can extend to the concept of God as life. You have a model dependent realism on the God concept itself. It also helps us to interpret divine revelations of the Bible in their interconnectedness, as I shall do in the next lecture. Here we shall stop this lecture. Thank you.